Any 10 pilots on this base? The Army colonel's voice cut through the Firebase command center like a blade. Silence. His men were pinned down in the valley. Without air support, they had minutes, not hours. Sarah Mitchell stood from the communications desk. I can fly. Every head whipped toward her. For 9 months, she'd been invisible here. The analyst who fixed radios and filed reports while soldiers fought. The colonel's eyes narrowed with doubt. One sergeant leaned to another, voice dripping skepticism. She looks like she belongs behind a desk, not in a cockpit. Sarah's gaze didn't waver. There's a warthog on the auxiliary strip. Give me 6 minutes. The room erupted in murmurs. The colonel stepped closer, testing her. You're telling me you can fly combat missions? Her voice cut through the noise, steady and cold. Sir, I've flown 73 close air support runs, 2 tours. I know what your men are facing down there. The doubt hung heavy in the air. What none of them knew was the call sign she carried, or why she earned it. Before we continue, if you believe actions speak louder than appearance, type underestimated below, and tell me where you're watching from. This story proves that capability is what counts. I read every comment. The firebase sat on the edge of nowhere. Bagram Airfield, Afghanistan, 2023. Sarah had arrived 9 months earlier as part of a joint operations coordination team. Her job was simple: monitor communications, coordinate logistics, keep the gears turning. She wasn't combat arms. She wasn't infantry. To the soldiers on this base, she was support staff. Necessary, but invisible. Every morning, she walked past the armory where soldiers prepped for patrol. They never looked at her. Every afternoon, she sat in briefings where operations were planned. They never asked her opinion. Every evening, she returned to her barracks alone while the combat troops gathered to debrief, to bond, to share the weight of what they carried. She didn't complain. She didn't push. She simply did her job with quiet precision. But beneath the headset and the analyst's uniform was something none of them suspected. Sarah Mitchell wasn't just an Air Force communications specialist. She was a combat pilot, and not just any pilot. She'd flown the A-1, Thunderbolt II, the Warthog, the flying tank built around a gun so powerful it could shred armor and save lives in the same breath. For 2 tours, she'd been the voice on the radio that ground troops prayed for, the shadow in the sky that turned the tide when everything seemed lost. But here at Bagram, nobody knew. Her flight status was inactive. Her pilot records were buried in personnel files nobody bothered to check. She was just another face in the support staff, another body filling a slot on the duty roster. Until tonight. Until the alarm shattered the routine, and the colonel's desperate question hung in the air. Any A-10 pilots on this base? The soldiers in the command center stared at her with open disbelief. The broad-shouldered staff sergeant crossed his arms, his expression a mix of confusion and condescension. Ma'am, with all due respect, you work communications. We need a combat pilot, someone who's actually flown under fire. Sarah's jaw tightened. She'd heard variations of this doubt her entire career. The assumptions, the dismissals, the quiet certainty that she couldn't possibly be what she claimed. She took a slow breath and met the sergeant's eyes. I am a combat pilot, and I've flown under fire more times than I can count. The colonel raised a hand, silencing the room. His face was carved from years of command, and his eyes held the weight of men dying in real time. Captain Mitchell, his use of her rank cut through the noise. You're telling me you can get that bird in the air and provide close air support? Yes, sir. How long since you've flown? 11 months. A murmur rippled through the room. 11 months was a lifetime in aviation. Skills degraded, reflexes slowed. The younger soldiers exchanged glances that said everything. She's rusty. She's been behind a desk too long. She's going to get someone killed. But the colonel didn't look away. And you're confident you can do this? Sarah's voice was steady as iron. "Sir, give me 6 minutes to preflight, and I'll have that warthog over your men in 15. I promise you." The silence that followed was suffocating. Then the colonel nodded once. "Get to the flight line. Now." Sarah pushed through the door into the night. The desert air hit her face, dry and cold. Behind her, she heard boots on gravel. The staff sergeant and 3 other soldiers followed, their faces skeptical, their weapons slung but ready. They weren't escorts. They were witnesses. They wanted to see if she was real, or just another support staffer talking big. The auxiliary strip sat on the far edge of the base, illuminated by scattered floodlights that cast harsh shadows across the tarmac. And there, sitting like a forgotten relic, was the A-10. Its paint was faded. Its edges were worn. Dust covered the canopy. It had been grounded for months, waiting for parts, waiting for a pilot, waiting for a reason to matter again. Sarah walked toward it with purpose, not too fast, not too slow, every step deliberate. Behind her, the staff sergeant muttered to one of the younger privates, "This is insane. She's going to kill herself." Another voice, older and scarred by multiple deployments, responded quietly, "If she gets that bird in the air, I'll be the first one to apologize." Sarah reached the ladder and climbed without hesitation. The cockpit smelled like dust and old hydraulic fluid. She settled into the seat, her hands moving across the controls with the muscle memory of 1,000 flights. The HUD was dark. The radios were silent. The systems were cold. She reached for the battery switch. Click. The panel flickered. Dim lights struggled to life. One by one, the gauges began to wake. She tapped a stubborn indicator with her knuckle. "Come on, girl. Wake up." On the ground, the soldiers watched in silence. The staff sergeant's arms were still crossed, but his expression had shifted. He was no longer looking at a desk jockey. He was looking at someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Sarah flipped the fuel pump switch. The right engine coughed violently, spitting smoke and dust into the night air. It wheezed. It faltered. Then it caught. The turbine spun into a steady roar that shook the tarmac. The second engine followed, rumbling to life with a sound like controlled thunder. The young private's mouth fell open. "Holy," the older soldier cut him off. "Told you." The canopy lowered with a hydraulic hiss. Sarah's voice came over the radio, calm and professional. "Bagram ground, this is Reaper 2-1. Systems green. Engines hot. Request taxi clearance to active runway." Reaper. The call sign hit the soldiers like a physical blow. In close air support circles, that name carried weight. Reaper pilots were the ones who arrived when everything else had failed. They were the last line of defense, the angel of death for enemies and the guardian angel for friendlies. The staff sergeant's face went pale. He keyed his radio, his voice tight. "Colonel, she's not just a pilot. I know what she is, Sergeant." The colonel's voice was tense, but steady. "I just pulled her file. Captain Sarah Mitchell. Call sign Reaper. 73 combat missions. Distinguished Flying Cross. Air Medal with Valor. She's the real deal." The sergeant lowered his radio slowly, his expression transforming from skepticism to something close to awe. He looked back at the A-10 as it began to taxi, its wheels grinding against the cracked runway. The sound reverberated across the entire base. Soldiers emerged from barracks and tents to watch. Mechanics stopped working. Guards turned from their posts. For months, this aircraft had sat silent. No, under the hands of a pilot they dismissed as just another support staffer, it was alive again. The warthog rumbled forward, dust and heat rising in its wake. The twin engines screamed with barely contained power. Sarah's voice came over the radio again, directed at the forward operating team in the valley. "Reaper 2-1 to ground team Alpha. I'm wheels up in 90 seconds. Hold your position. I'm coming." In the valley, 15 miles away, Soldiers pressed against rocks and mud, enemy fire tearing through the air above them. The team leader, a young lieutenant with blood on his hands from treating wounded, keyed his radio with shaking fingers. "Copy, Reaper. We've got 3 critically wounded. We can't hold much longer. You won't have to. Mark your position with IR strobes. I'll find you." The A-10 turned onto the active runway. Sarah locked the brakes and pushed the throttles forward. The engines howled. The aircraft shook with restrained violence. She released the brakes. The Warthog surged forward, accelerating with brutal efficiency. 30 knots, 50, 70. The nose lifted. The wheels left the ground. And just like that, Captain Sarah Mitchell was airborne, not an analyst, not support staff, a warrior returning to war. The A-10 climbed into the black Afghan night, its silhouette stark against the stars. Inside the cockpit, Sarah ran through her combat checks with mechanical precision. Weapon systems online. Targeting pod active. GAU 8 Avenger cannon, loaded and ready. The 30mm rotary cannon that defined the Warthog. 7 barrels. 4,000 rounds per minute. A weapon so powerful that firing it slowed the aircraft in midair. Her radio crackled. "Reaper 2-1, Bagram Tower. You're cleared into the valley. Ground Team Alpha is at grid November Victor 732. Enemy forces estimated at 40+, dug in on the ridgeline. Copy. Inbound. 2 minutes." Sarah pushed the stick forward, diving toward the valley. The altimeter unwound. 5,000 feet. 4,000. 3. The ground rose up to meet her, jagged and hostile. Through the targeting pod, she could see the heat signatures. Friendly forces clustered behind a rocky outcrop. Enemy positions spread across the ridge above them, muzzle flashes winking in the darkness. She'd seen this before, too many times. Troops pinned down, running out of ammunition, running out of time. The math was simple and brutal. Without air support, they died. With it, they had a chance. But what nobody in that valley knew yet was why she'd earned the call sign Reaper. It wasn't because she was good. It was because she was relentless. Once she locked onto a target, she didn't leave until the job was done or her ammunition was gone, whichever came last. 3 years earlier, in a different valley, Sarah had answered a call just like this one. A Marine reconnaissance team, 12 men, surrounded by over 60 enemy fighters. She'd arrived with 10 minutes of fuel and a nearly empty ammunition counter. Any sane pilot would have made a single pass and retreated to refuel. Sarah had made 7 passes. She'd burned through every round of 30mm ammunition, every rocket, and exhausted her fuel until warning lights screamed at her to return to base. When she finally pulled away, 11 of those 12 Marines were still alive. 1 had died before she arrived, but the other 11 walked out because she refused to leave. The Marine Corps had sent her a handwritten letter. The commanding general himself. It sat in her quarters, framed but private. The words were simple. "You are the reason they came home. Thank you." Now, as she lined up her first pass over this new valley, Sarah felt the same cold calm settle over her. The doubt from the soldiers on the ground didn't matter. The skepticism from the command center didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was bringing these men home alive. Ground Team Alpha, Reaper 2-1. I have visual on your position. Stay down. Danger close in 5 seconds. The team leader's voice came back, tight with pain and exhaustion. Copy, Reaper. God, we're glad you're here. Sarah didn't respond. She was already in the zone. The place where time slowed and the aircraft became an extension of her body. The GAU-8 spun up with a sound like tearing metal. She squeezed the trigger. The cannon roared. A sound unlike anything else in warfare. Not a rapid staccato, but a continuous bellow that shook the air itself. Depleted uranium rounds screamed downrange at 3,000 feet per second. The ridgeline erupted in fire and dust. Enemy positions disintegrated. Fighters who'd been pouring fire onto the Americans seconds earlier simply ceased to exist. Sarah pulled up hard, banking left, already lining up the next pass. Her eyes scanned the targeting screen. More heat signatures. More targets. The enemy was dispersed, trying to flank the pinned Americans from 2 directions. She keyed the radio. Ground team, you've got fighters moving to your 6 o'clock. 15 meters. Stay flat. Copy. She rolled inverted, pulling the nose down into a dive that would have made any instructor scream. The G forces pressed her into the seat. The HUD tracked the targets. She fired again, rockets this time. 2 AGM-65 Mavericks streaked away from the wings, their motors leaving white trails in the darkness. The explosions lit up the valley like daylight. On the ground, the staff sergeant from Bagram was listening to the radio feed, his face pale. She's insane. She's flying danger close with no margin for error. The older soldier beside him shook his head slowly. She's not insane. She's exactly what those men need. 11 months earlier, Sarah had been flying a routine close air support mission over Helmand Province. Routine in name only. Nothing about Afghanistan was routine. She'd been supporting a special forces team conducting a raid on a suspected weapons cache. Intelligence had said light resistance. Intelligence had been catastrophically wrong. The team had walked into a kill zone. Over 80 enemy fighters had been waiting. The initial ambush killed 2 Americans in the first 30 seconds. The rest took cover in a half-collapsed building, surrounded on 3 sides, taking fire from rooftops, windows, and alleyways. Sarah had been 20 miles away when the call came through. The desperation in the ground commander's voice had said everything. We're dying here. Help us. She'd pushed the throttles to maximum, racing toward the coordinates. Her wingman, Captain Ramirez, had followed. 2 A-10s against an entrenched enemy force. The odds were bad, but not impossible. What happened next was burned into her memory like a brand. She'd made her first gun run, suppressing the northern rooftops. Ramirez had taken the southern approach, but the enemy had been ready. They'd been waiting for the air support. Someone had given them MPADs, man-portable air defense systems, shoulder-fired missiles. Sarah had seen the launch signature, a white streak rising from an alley. She'd screamed into the radio, "Ramirez, break right, missile." But the warning had come a half-second too late. The missile had struck Ramirez's right engine. The A-10 was built to take punishment, but a direct hit from a manpad was beyond its design limits. His aircraft had shuddered, trailing fire and smoke. Ramirez's voice had been calm, almost detached. "I'm hit. Engine 2 is gone. I'm losing hydraulics. Get out of the kill zone," Sarah had ordered, her voice sharp with fear. "Head for the emergency strip." "Negative. These men need us. I've still got 1 engine and half my ammunition. I'm staying." "Ramirez, that's an order. Get clear. Then court-martial me later, Reaper. Right now, I'm finishing the mission." For the next 12 minutes, Sarah and Ramirez had flown a pattern of coordinated destruction. Sarah would draw fire, pull the enemy's attention, and Ramirez would strike from an unexpected angle. They'd worked together for 2 years. They knew each other's flying styles like dancers, knew each other's steps. They'd cleared the rooftops. They'd silenced the alleyways. They'd given the Special Forces team room to breathe, to move, to fight back. 11 of the 13 pinned soldiers had made it out alive. But Ramirez hadn't. His damaged aircraft had held together just long enough to complete the mission. Then, on his approach to the emergency strip, the remaining engine had failed. He'd tried to glide in, but the A-10 wasn't built for gliding. It was built for punishment, not grace. He'd ejected at 300 feet. Too low. His chute hadn't fully deployed before he hit the ground. Sarah had been circling above, watching helplessly as medics raced to his position. She'd known before they reached him. The angle of impact, the way his body lay motionless in the dust. Ramirez had died saving 13 men he'd never met, and Sarah had carried that weight every single day since. She'd been grounded by command afterward, not as punishment, but as protocol. Any pilot involved in a fatal incident underwent mandatory review. The investigation had taken months. By the time she'd been cleared to fly again, her orders had changed. She'd been reassigned to Bagram, communications and coordination, a desk job. For 11 months, she'd sat in that command center, listening to other pilots fly the missions she was trained for. She'd filed reports. She'd coordinated logistics. She'd been professional and efficient, and utterly, completely miserable. But tonight, as she pulled out of another gun run and watched enemy positions evaporate under her cannon fire, Sarah felt something she hadn't felt in almost a year. Purpose. Ground Team Alpha, Reaper 2-1. Enemy forces on the ridge are neutralized. You're clear to move. The team leader's voice was thick with emotion. Copy, Reaper. We're mobile. Thank you. Thank you so much. Sarah didn't respond immediately. She was circling the valley, scanning for any remaining threats. Her fuel was dropping. Her ammunition counter was running low. But she wasn't leaving. Not yet. Not until she was certain these men were safe. Because that's what Ramirez would have done. Reaper 2-1. Be advised. Ground Team Alpha reports additional enemy movement. Northeast Ridge. Approximately 20 fighters moving to cut off their extraction route. Sarah's eyes snapped to the targeting screen. There. Heat signatures moving fast, trying to flank the Americans as they withdrew. She was low on ammunition. Her fuel gauge was dipping into the yellow. Any reasonable pilot would call for backup, maintain altitude, and wait for reinforcements. Sarah wasn't interested in being reasonable. She banked hard, diving toward the northeast ridge. The A-10 screamed down through 3,000 feet, the airframe shuddering with speed. She was pushing the aircraft beyond its recommended dive velocity. The wings flexed, the fuselage groaned. She didn't care. Ground team, get your heads down. Danger close? 15 seconds. She armed her last 2 rockets and lined up the shot. The enemy fighters were scrambling for cover, finally realizing that the aircraft above them wasn't leaving. They'd made a fatal miscalculation. They'd assumed one pilot, low on ammunition and fuel, would break off and retreat. They'd assumed wrong. Sarah fired both rockets simultaneously. The Mavericks streaked away, their propellant trails bright against the dark sky. 2 seconds later, the ridgeline exploded. The shock wave was visible even from altitude, a rolling wave of dust and fire that engulfed the enemy position. But the explosion revealed something else, something that made Sarah's blood run cold. In the thermal imaging, she could see them. Not fighters, civilians. 3 of them, huddled behind the rocks, too close to the enemy position. Children. Her heart stopped. She'd fired. The rockets were already in flight. Nothing could stop them now. Time seemed to stretch, each millisecond an eternity. She watched the thermal signatures, waiting for the inevitable, waiting to see those 3 small shapes disappear in the blast. But they didn't disappear. The rockets impacted 15 meters away. The enemy position was obliterated, but the shockwave pushed the civilians backward, away from the blast zone. They fell. They tumbled down the slope. But they didn't vanish. Sarah's hands were shaking on the stick. She'd come within 15 meters of killing children. 15 meters between a successful strike and a war crime. A margin of error that separated a hero from a monster. She circled lower, watching as the 3 civilians picked themselves up and ran into the darkness, away from the battle, away from the death. They were terrified, but alive. Reaper 2-1, what's your status? The tower's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts. Sarah forced her voice to stay steady. Target neutralized. Ground team is clear. I'm RTB. Return to base. She pulled the stick back, climbing away from the valley. Her fuel was critically low now. Red lights blinked warnings across her console. She had maybe 10 minutes of flight time left, just enough to make it back to Bagram. As she flew through the dark sky, Sarah's mind replayed that moment over and over. 15 meters. That's all it had been. 15 meters between success and catastrophe. She'd made the right call. The intelligence was good. The enemy was exactly where they were supposed to be, but warfare didn't care about right calls. It only cared about results. And the result was that 3 children were alive because of luck, not skill. When she finally approached Bagram, the entire base was awake. Floodlights illuminated the runway. Soldiers lined the taxiway, watching as the battered A-10 came home. Sarah's landing was textbook perfect, despite her shaking hands. The wheels kissed the tarmac with barely a jolt. She taxied to the apron and shut down the engines. The silence after the turbines spun down was deafening. She sat in the cockpit for a long moment, her hands still gripping the stick, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Then she popped the canopy and climbed down the ladder. The colonel was waiting at the bottom. So was the staff sergeant. So were 24 soldiers who'd watched her take off and wondered if she'd come back. The colonel didn't salute. He simply extended his hand. Sarah took it. His grip was firm, his eyes steady. Captain Mitchell, those 13 men are alive because of you. Thank you, Sarah nodded, unable to trust her voice. The debriefing room was sparse. A table, a few chairs, a map of the valley pinned to the wall with red markers showing enemy positions. Sarah sat with her hands folded in front of her, her flight suit still smelling like hydraulic fluid and cordite. The colonel entered with the staff sergeant and the older soldier who'd been on the flight line. All 3 sat across from her. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then the colonel opened a folder. I pulled your complete service record after you took off. I should have done it sooner. I apologize for that. Sarah said nothing. 73 close air support missions. Distinguished Flying Cross for actions in Helmand Province. Air Medal with Valor for Kandahar. Silver Star recommendation pending for. He paused, reading. For actions involving the death of Captain Marcus Ramirez. At Ramirez's name, Sarah's jaw tightened. The colonel saw it. He closed the folder. Captain Mitchell, why didn't you tell anyone what you were? Sarah met his eyes. Sir, with respect, nobody asked. When I arrived here, I was assigned to communications. I did that job. I didn't think it was appropriate to announce that I was a combat pilot when my orders said otherwise. The staff sergeant leaned forward. Ma'am, I owe you an apology. I said things tonight that were out of line. Sarah turned to him. Sergeant, you said what most people think when they look at me. I'm used to it. I don't expect apologies for honesty. That's not honesty, ma'am. That's prejudice, and I was wrong. The older soldier spoke for the first time. His voice was rough, weathered by years of combat. I've been in the Army for 23 years. I've worked with hundreds of pilots. Air Force, Navy, Marines. I've never seen anyone fly like you did tonight. You were danger close on every pass. You burned through your ammunition to protect men you'd never met. And when you left, you didn't leave until you were absolutely certain they were safe. He paused. That's not just skill, ma'am. That's something else. Sarah looked down at her hands. That's what we're supposed to do. Protect the people on the ground. That's the entire job. The colonel shook his head slowly. No, Captain. The job is to provide air support. What you did tonight went beyond that. Ground Team Alpha's lieutenant is filing a report. He's recommending you for another air medal. Maybe more. I don't need medals, sir. Maybe not. But the men you saved tonight, need to know they were worth saving. And the next time someone looks at you and makes assumptions based on your appearance, they need to remember what you did. Because you didn't just save 13 lives tonight. You reminded everyone on this base what real capability looks like. Sarah felt something crack inside her chest. Not breaking, opening. For 11 months, she'd carried the weight of Ramirez's death like a stone in her lungs. She'd questioned everything. Whether she should have ordered him to leave sooner. Whether she could have drawn more fire. Whether she deserved to keep flying when he was dead. But tonight, in that valley, she'd done what Ramirez would have wanted. She'd stayed until the job was done. She'd protected the people who needed her. She'd honored his sacrifice by living up to the standard he'd set. The colonel stood. The others followed. Sarah rose to her feet, expecting a handshake or a dismissal. Instead, the colonel came to attention and saluted. It wasn't a casual salute. It was the kind given to someone who'd earned it through fire and blood. The staff sergeant and the older soldier followed suit. Sarah returned the salute, her hand crisp and steady. When they lowered their hands, the colonel's expression softened slightly. "Captain Mitchell, effective immediately, your orders are being revised. You're being reassigned to flight status. We have 4 A-10s on this base and only 2 pilots. As of now, you're one of them." Sarah's breath caught. "Sir? You belong in the air, Captain, not behind a desk. We need you up there. And more importantly, the soldiers on the ground need to know you're available when things go wrong." For the first time in 11 months, Sarah felt the weight lift. Not completely. Ramirez's death would always be with her. But now, instead of being a burden that kept her grounded, it was a reminder of why she flew. "Thank you, sir." The colonel nodded. "Dismissed, Captain. Get some rest. You're back on the flight schedule tomorrow." Sarah walked out into the dawn. The Afghan sun was just breaking over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. The A-10 sat on the tarmac where she'd left it, ground crews already swarming over it, refueling, rearming, preparing it for the next mission. She stopped beside the aircraft, her hand resting on the scarred fuselage. This machine had carried her through 74 combat missions now. It had protected her when missiles flew. It had brought her home when engines failed. It had been her weapon, her shield, and her purpose. But more than that, it had been her connection to the people on the ground, the soldiers who called for help when everything fell apart, the men and women who looked up at the sky and prayed for salvation. A voice called out behind her, "Captain Mitchell." She turned. It was the young private who'd been on the flight line. He approached hesitantly, his face uncertain. "Ma'am, I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for doubting you. And thank you for what you did." Sarah gave him a small smile. "Don't apologize for doubt, Private. Just remember the lesson. Capability doesn't announce itself. It proves itself when it matters most." He nodded, absorbing the words. Then he saluted and walked away. Sarah turned back to the A-10. In a few hours, she'd climb back into this cockpit. She'd run pre-flight checks. She'd wait for the call. And when it came, she'd do exactly what she'd done last night. She'd fly into danger. She'd protect the people who needed her. She'd bring them home, because that's what Reapers did. Not because they wanted glory. Not because they needed recognition. But because somewhere out there, soldiers were counting on them. And that was the only thing that mattered. To everyone who typed underestimated and shared where you're watching from, thank you for standing with our heroes. Subscribe for more stories like this and unsung American heroes. See you in the next one.